1875, the obese daughter, who was used in his father's bed experiments. Then the father paid a terrible price. A preacher's cabin deep in the West Virginia hills. A daughter kept fat and hidden. Laudanum purchased in the dark, and a chanting that made neighbors turn away. Then, one morning, a barn accident that wasn't an accident at all. A journal under the floorboards that twisted Scripture into something unspeakable. A ledger of marks that counted every night. And, behind a cold cellar wall, a box no one should ever open. This is how her silence finally broke, and how the jury delivered their own kind of justice. But when evil hides behind a Bible, who decides the price of deliverance? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you're brave enough for this journey. Subscribe so you don't miss stories that reveal the darkest corners of human nature. Stony Lick Hollow sat in a fold of the Appalachian Mountains where West Virginia's ridges pressed so close together that winter arrived early and spring came late. In 1875, the community numbered fewer than 200 souls, most of them scattered across hillside farms, connected by footpaths that turned to mud 6 months of the year. The nearest county seat lay 2 days' ride through terrain that could break a horse's leg, and the sheriff's jurisdiction ended where the good roads did. What happened in the hollow stayed in the hollow, settled by handshakes and Scripture rather than warrants and judges. This isolation, recorded in the county surveyor's reports as a geographical inconvenience, would prove to be the perfect incubator for a crime that festered in darkness for nearly 4 years. Hezekiah Thorne commanded respect in this closed world through the twin pillars of faith and knowledge. A widower for 9 years, he had buried his wife after a difficult childbirth, left her weakened and susceptible to fever, or so the community understood, from his own account given at her graveside. He preached on Sundays in a voice that carried judgment like thunder, and during the week he dispensed herbal remedies from the same cabin where he raised his only child alone. The combination made him indispensable and untouchable. When Thorne quoted Scripture, no one in the hollow possessed the education to question his interpretations, and when he prescribed poultices or tinctures, people paid in goods and gratitude. A traveling peddler's ledger, later submitted to the court, showed that between 1873 and 1876, Thorne purchased laudanum in quantities that exceeded the combined use of every other household in 3 counties. His daughter Elspeth became the subject of pitying whispers long before anyone suspected the truth. She appeared in public perhaps 4 times a year, always at her father's side, always silent and shuffling. By her 19th year, she had grown grotesquely obese, her body swollen in ways that the women of the hollow attributed to poor breeding or simple-mindedness. Hezekiah explained her condition with sorrowful authority, claiming she inherited her mother's weak constitution along with a mental slowness that required constant supervision. He spoke of her affliction as a cross he bore with Christian patience, and the community accepted this narrative without question. A deacon's wife, testifying years later at the trial, admitted she once suggested that Elspeth might benefit from time among other young women, but Thorne's response had been immediate and final. His daughter's purity required protection from the corrupting influences of the world. The first documented evidence that something was profoundly wrong came in the form of a neighbor's statement given to the county clerk. Widow Martha Jessup, seeking a remedy for her rheumatism, approached the Thorne cabin on a moonless night in late September of 1875. As she neared the door, she heard not prayer but a rhythmic, guttural chanting in Hezekiah's voice, words she could not quite make out, but that carried an urgency that made her blood run cold. Beneath the chanting came another sound, thin and high like an animal caught in a trap. Mrs. Jessup stated under oath that she backed away without knocking and never returned. When asked why she did not report what she heard, her answer captured the essence of the hollow's willful blindness. Hezekiah Thorne was a man of God, and she was just a widow with no education. So who would believe her interpretation of sounds in the night? That same autumn, Dr. Silas Croft made his quarterly circuit through the mountain communities, contracted by the county to provide medical services where no permanent physician would settle. Educated at a college in Pennsylvania and possessed of a methodical, scientific mind, Croft represented an intrusion of the outside world into the hollow's insular logic. On the evening of October 3, 1875, as documented in his personal diary later entered as evidence, he was riding past the Thorne property when he heard what he described as a sound of profound distress, human but somehow inhuman, coming from the cabin. The sound ceased abruptly, followed by an unnatural silence that hung in the mountain air like smoke. Croft noted the incident with clinical precision, including the time, the temperature, and his own visceral reaction of unease. He did not investigate that night, a decision he would later tell the court haunted him, but he marked the Thorne cabin in his mental map as a place requiring closer attention. Within 6 months, that attention would crack open a secret so monstrous that even hardened mountain men would weep at the evidence. On the morning of March 17, 1876, Hezekiah Thorne was found dead in his barn, his body crushed beneath a piece of threshing equipment that had somehow activated while he worked alone. The discovery came when a neighboring farmer, arriving to borrow tools, found the barn door standing open and followed the trail of blood to where Thorne lay twisted in the machinery's iron teeth. The farmer's statement, preserved in the sheriff's initial report, described a scene of obvious mechanical failure and tragic timing. Within hours, the community had assembled its own verdict. An accident, unfortunate but explicable, the kind of death that claimed farmers every season. The sheriff, a local man named Abner Coyle, who had known Thorne for 20 years, saw no reason to question this consensus. He ordered the body removed and prepared a death certificate citing accidental causes, fully expecting the matter to be closed before sunset. Dr. Silas Croft arrived in the hollow 2 days later on his scheduled circuit and learned of Thorne's death from the undertaker, who had prepared the body for burial. As the only licensed physician within 3 counties, Croft held the legal authority to review any death that had not received proper medical examination, and something in the undertaker's nervous manner prompted him to exercise that authority. The body had already been washed and dressed, but Croft insisted on conducting a thorough examination in the undertaker's back room. What he found contradicted everything the community wanted to believe. Documented in his official autopsy report, later submitted as Exhibit A in the criminal proceedings, were defensive wounds on both of Thorne's hands and forearms, deep cuts and bruises consistent with a man trying to ward off or escape from something. The positioning of the wounds indicated they had been inflicted before death, not during the machinery's operation. Croft's report concluded with a statement that would ignite the investigation. These injuries were inconsistent with accidental death and suggested the deceased had been conscious and struggling in the moments before the fatal crushing. Sheriff Coyle, summoned to review Croft's findings, responded with barely concealed irritation. His handwritten notes from that meeting, preserved in the county archives, reveal a man more concerned with maintaining social order than pursuing uncomfortable truths. He argued that Thorne could have injured his hands trying to free himself from the machinery, that defensive wounds proved nothing except panic in a man's final moments. But Croft had legal standing to refuse to sign the death certificate, and without that signature, Thorne could not be buried in consecrated ground. The standoff created a procedural crisis that forced the sheriff to at least go through the motions of investigation, though his notes make clear he expected to find nothing that would disturb the community's preferred narrative. The second discovery came when Croft, asserting his medical authority, demanded to examine Elspeth Thorne to assess her mental state and ability to provide testimony about her father's death. She had been found inside the cabin on the morning of the incident, sitting motionless at the kitchen table, unresponsive to questions. The community attributed her condition to shock and grief, the natural reaction of a simple-minded daughter who had lost her only protector. Croft conducted his examination in the presence of two women from the Hollow, their attendance required by propriety. His findings, recorded with clinical precision, shattered every assumption. Elspeth's body showed unmistakable signs of having recently given birth, including an enlarged uterus, stretched abdominal skin, and breasts producing milk. The delivery had occurred no more than 2 weeks prior, Croft estimated, yet there was no infant in the Thorne household and no record of any pregnancy. When he questioned the attending women, both testified they had never seen Elspeth pregnant, though one admitted she had not laid eyes on the girl in nearly 8 months. The medical evidence created an impossible situation that even Sheriff Coyle could not ignore. A young woman had given birth in complete secrecy in an isolated cabin where she lived alone with her father. The father was now dead under suspicious circumstances, and there was no child. Croft's examination report, submitted to the county prosecutor along with his refusal to sign the death certificate, posed questions that demanded answers. Where was the infant? Who was the father? And what connection existed between the missing child and Hezekiah Thorne's violent death? The prosecutor, recognizing the potential for scandal that could reach beyond the Hollow, ordered the cabin sealed as a potential crime scene and authorized Croft to conduct a thorough search. What the doctor would find hidden in that cabin would transform a suspicious death into evidence of evil so methodical and documented that even the most faithful would turn away in horror. Dr. Silas Croft entered the Thorne cabin on March 21, 1876, accompanied by Sheriff Coyle and a deputy who served as witness to whatever evidence might be discovered. The interior matched every expectation of a widower's household, sparse and orderly, with a Bible prominently displayed on the kitchen table and religious texts stacked on a shelf above the cold fireplace. The single bedroom contained 2 narrow beds separated by a wooden partition, a detail Croft noted in his search log as unusual given Elspeth's supposed need for constant supervision. The deputy's statement, entered into evidence, described the cabin as unremarkable, except for an oppressive atmosphere that made him want to leave immediately, though he attributed this feeling to knowledge of the recent death rather than any physical characteristic of the space. Croft's search began methodically, examining every surface and container for evidence of the missing infant or clues to Elspeth's hidden pregnancy. He found nothing in the obvious places, no baby clothes or medical supplies beyond the expected herbalist's stock. But his training had taught him that secrets often resided in spaces people thought protected, and farmhouses of that era commonly featured hidden compartments for valuables or documents. In the bedroom, he began testing the floorboards near Elspeth's bed, pressing each plank to detect looseness or hollow sounds beneath. On his third pass across the room, a board near the wall shifted under his weight with a distinctive give that indicated it had been pried up repeatedly. The sheriff's report documents that Croft used a pry bar to lift 3 consecutive boards, revealing a narrow cavity in the joists below where someone had deliberately created a hiding space approximately 2 feet long and 8 inches deep. Inside the cavity lay a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by handling and secured with a small brass lock that had corroded in the damp space beneath the floor. Croft's evidence log describes the journal as approximately 7 inches by 10 inches, filled with dense handwriting on pages that had begun to yellow at the edges. The lock proved no obstacle. The deputy broke it with a single twist of his knife. What followed, documented in Croft's statement to the prosecutor, was a descent into depravity so methodically recorded that it read like a twisted scientific treatise. The first entries, dated June of 1872, began with scriptural quotations about purity and bloodlines, verses that Hezekiah Thorne had apparently interpreted as divine instruction. But within pages, the theological language gave way to clinical descriptions of what he called his experiments, a term that barely disguised the systematic sexual abuse of his daughter. The journal entries, later read in their entirety during the trial and preserved in the court transcripts, detailed a progression of escalating violation that Thorne framed as a holy duty. He wrote of preparing Elspeth through the administration of laudanum to ensure her compliance, describing dosages and effects with the precision of a pharmacist. He documented specific dates and times of his assaults, which he termed sessions of purification, noting her physical responses and his own religious ecstasy in language that merged scripture with obscenity. By 1874, the entries revealed his belief that impregnating his daughter would produce a child of pure bloodline, cleansed of the corruption he believed infected the wider world. The journal showed no awareness of wrongdoing, only a growing frustration when Elspeth failed to conceive despite his repeated violations, which he attributed to her unworthiness rather than his sin. The final entries, written in the months before his death, documented a successful pregnancy with the detached interest of a farmer noting livestock breeding. Thorne recorded the swelling of Elspeth's body, which he disguised to the community by increasing her food portions until obesity masked her condition. He wrote of her labor in February of 1876, a delivery he attended alone in the cabin while the Hollow slept through a snowstorm. But the triumph he anticipated turned to rage in his final entry, dated February 19th. The infant had been born dead, what he called a failed vessel, and an unclean offering that proved his daughter's fundamental corruption. The entry ended with a chilling declaration: the failed experiment would be returned to the earth, and a new vessel would be prepared once Elspeth recovered her strength. The implication that the abuse would continue, that Thorne intended to impregnate his daughter again, hung in the air of that cabin like poison as Croft finished reading. Sheriff Coyle's face, according to Croft's testimony, had gone ashen by the time the doctor closed the journal. The deputy had excused himself to vomit in the yard. But the physical evidence still eluded them. The body of the infant that Thorne claimed to have returned to the earth. Croft knew that without the child's remains, a defense attorney could argue the journal was fiction or madness rather than confession. Somewhere in or near that cabin lay proof that would transform disturbing words into undeniable crime, and Croft's medical training told him exactly where a man like Thorne would hide something he needed to keep close but concealed. The cold cellar beneath the cabin floor beckoned, its stone walls promising to yield secrets that even the journal's horror had not fully revealed. The entrance to the cold cellar lay beneath a trapdoor in the kitchen floor, its iron ring handle worn smooth by decades of use. Doctor. Croft descended the wooden ladder with a lantern in one hand, Sheriff Coyle following reluctantly behind while the deputy remained above, still recovering from the journal's revelations. The cellar stretched approximately 12 feet square, its walls constructed of stacked fieldstone mortared with clay, the air thick with the smell of earth and preserved foods. Wooden shelves lined 3 walls, holding jars of vegetables and salted meat, the ordinary provisions of mountain life that made the space feel mundane despite the horror unfolding above. Croft's search notes, submitted as part of the evidence chain, describe his methodical examination of every jar and container, finding nothing unusual until he began inspecting the stone walls themselves for irregularities in their construction. The 4th wall, the one facing north and built deepest into the hillside, showed signs of recent disturbance. The mortar between several stones appeared fresher than the surrounding sections, lighter in color, and crumbling slightly when Croft scraped it with his knife. Sheriff Coyle's statement confirms that he initially dismissed this observation, arguing that root cellars required constant maintenance and repair work proved nothing. But Croft persisted, using the pry bar he had brought from above to work at the edges of the suspicious stones. After 20 minutes of careful leverage, 3 stones came loose in sequence, revealing a cavity behind the wall that had been deliberately created and then sealed. The opening measured roughly 18 inches square and extended back into darkness beyond the reach of the lantern light. Croft reached into the cavity with understandable hesitation, his hand disappearing into the cold space while the sheriff held the lantern closer. His fingers encountered wood, smooth and shaped, clearly manufactured rather than natural. He withdrew a small wooden box, crudely constructed, but fitted with a hinged lid that had been sealed with wax. The box measured approximately 10 inches long, 6 inches wide, and 4 inches deep, sized with terrible purpose for its contents. The evidence log describes the box as made from pine, with no decoration or marking, except for scratches on the lid that might have been accidental or might have been the desperate clawing of someone sealing away an unbearable truth. Croft set the box on the cellar floor and opened it before the sheriff could suggest waiting for the prosecutor to be present. Inside, wrapped in linen cloth that had been soaked in some preservative solution, lay the remains of an infant so small it could have fit in one hand. The body had been carefully prepared, the umbilical cord tied off with thread, the tiny limbs arranged in a posture of sleep. Croft's medical examination, conducted immediately and documented with clinical precision despite the emotional weight of the discovery, determined the infant had been stillborn or died within minutes of birth, a male child showing no obvious defects except the profound abnormality of his parentage. The preservation, while crude, had been sufficient to maintain tissue integrity for identification purposes. This was the physical proof that transformed Hezekiah Thorne's journal from the ravings of a madman into the documented confession of a monster who had impregnated his own daughter and hidden the evidence of his crime behind stone and silence. But the box contained a second item that would prove even more devastating in its implications. Beneath the infant's wrapped form lay a small ledger, no larger than a man's hand, bound in cloth that had protected it from the cellar's moisture. Croft opened it carefully, finding pages filled not with words but with symbols and marks that initially appeared meaningless. The sheriff's testimony describes his confusion at what seemed like the scribblings of someone who could not write, random marks that proved nothing. But Croft, trained in observation and pattern recognition, saw the truth immediately. The ledger was a calendar, meticulously maintained over years, with symbols that corresponded to events in a young woman's life. A circle represented the full moon and marked her monthly cycles. A dark cross, drawn heavy and repeated, marked specific dates with horrifying regularity, appearing 2 or 3 times each month, stretching back through page after page. The pattern became undeniable when Croft compared the ledger's dates to entries in Hezekiah's journal, which he had brought down to the cellar. The dark crosses aligned perfectly with Thorne's documented sessions, each mark in Elspeth's hand corresponding to an assault described in her father's words. She had been counting, recording, bearing witness to her own destruction, with the only tools available to someone kept illiterate and isolated. The final pages of the ledger showed the crosses, stopping in June of 1875, replaced by careful marks that tracked the progression of her pregnancy. Simple drawings of her body growing larger, leading to a final entry in February of 1876. A small cross inside a box, the symbol of death that needed no translation. Below it, drawn with such force that the pencil had torn through the page, was a single word in crude, barely formed letters that Elspeth had somehow taught herself to write. Enough! Sheriff Coyle's resistance crumbled completely in that moment, documented in his revised statement where he admitted his previous willingness to accept easy answers had been a moral failure. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. A father's confession matched a daughter's testimony, the victim and perpetrator both leaving written records that corroborated each other in ways that eliminated any possibility of misunderstanding or false accusation. The infant's body provided physical proof of the incestuous pregnancy, and Elspeth's final word, written in rage or desperation or both, explained everything about Hezekiah Thorne's death in the barn. With the box and its contents secured as evidence, Croft and the sheriff climbed back up to the cabin's main floor to do what the law demanded: confront Elspeth Thorne and hear her account of how her father had died and who had delivered the justice that formal law had failed to provide while she suffered in silence. Elspeth Thorne was brought to the county jail on March 22, 1876, charged with the murder of her father. The confrontation in the cabin, documented in Sheriff Coyle's arrest report, had lasted less than 10 minutes. When presented with the evidence from the cellar, the journal, and her own ledger, Elspeth had broken her silence not with denials, but with a calm, detailed confession that chilled both men to their cores. She described disabling the safety mechanism on the threshing equipment 3 days before her father's death, waiting for the precise moment when he would be alone and vulnerable. She had called to him from the barn door, claiming injury, and when he rushed to her aid, she had activated the machinery and pushed him into its path. Her statement, transcribed verbatim by the sheriff, ended with words that would echo through the trial. "He made me a graveyard, so I made him one too." The trial began on May 15, 1876, in a courthouse packed beyond capacity with spectators from 3 counties. The prosecutor, a methodical man named Dalton Reeves, presented a case that was legally unassailable. He entered Elspeth's signed confession as Exhibit 1, established the physical evidence of Hezekiah's death as inconsistent with accident, and called witnesses who testified to Elspeth's presence in the barn that morning. His closing argument, preserved in the court transcripts, acknowledged the horror of her abuse, but insisted that civilization depended on law, not vengeance, and that murder remained murder regardless of provocation. The jury, 12 men drawn from the farming communities surrounding Stony Lick Hollow, listened with faces that revealed nothing their weathered features impassive as the prosecutor demanded justice for a man they had once considered righteous. The defense fell to a young attorney named Samuel Webb, court-appointed and initially overwhelmed by the evidence against his client. His strategy, revolutionary for the time and documented in legal journals that studied the case decades later, was not to deny the killing, but to put Hezekiah Thorne himself on trial. Webb entered the father's journal as defense evidence, a move the prosecutor had not anticipated, and spent 2 full days reading selected passages aloud to a courtroom that grew more horrified with each revelation. The journal's clinical descriptions of abuse, the theological justifications for incest, and the documented years of systematic rape created an atmosphere of such profound revulsion that several jurors were observed wiping tears. Webb then presented Elspeth's ledger, explaining the symbol system to jurors who understood illiteracy and isolation, making them see the desperate documentation of a young woman with no other means of recording her suffering or crying for help that never came. The turning point came when the remains of the infant were presented to the jury. The small pine box opened in the hushed courtroom while Webb explained what the child represented, not just the fruit of incest, but proof that Hezekiah Thorne had intended to continue his abuse indefinitely, treating his daughter as breeding stock for his twisted vision of bloodline purity. The foreman's later statement, given to a newspaper reporter, described that moment as the one where every man in the jury box understood they were not judging a murderer, but witnessing the aftermath of evil that formal law had been powerless to stop. Webb's masterstroke came in his closing argument when he asked the jury a question that reframed everything. If a man keeps another human being in captivity, subjects them to years of torture and rape, and promises more of the same, does the captive who breaks free and strikes back commit murder or self-liberation? Elspeth took the stand on the trial's 8th day, the first time most spectators had heard her voice. Her testimony, recorded by the court stenographer in 32 pages that remain archived in the county records, was delivered in a tone so calm and steady it unnerved those who expected tears or rage. She recounted her life in factual detail, describing the first assault when she was 14 years old, the gradual increase in frequency and brutality, the laudanum that kept her compliant and confused. She explained how she had taught herself to write the single word, enough, by copying letters from her father's Bible when he slept, practicing in dirt and ash until her hand remembered the shapes. She described the stillbirth of her child, a daughter not a son, as Hezekiah had written, and her realization that if she did not act, her father would simply impregnate her again until he got the result he wanted, or she died trying to provide it. Her final statement, quoted in every subsequent account of the trial, became the moral center around which the verdict turned. She looked directly at the jury and said there was no law in that house but him, so I became the law. The courtroom remained silent for a full minute after she finished, the weight of her words settling over judge, jury, and spectators like a physical presence. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, returning with a verdict that shocked the prosecutor and transformed the case into legend. They found Elspeth Thorne not guilty of murder, with the foreman explaining in his statement to the court that while the defendant had caused her father's death, Hezekiah Thorne was the one guilty of murder, having killed his daughter's life and future long before she struck back. It was an act of mountain justice that acknowledged what formal law could not, that some evils are so profound they place their victims beyond the reach of conventional judgment. Elspeth walked free from the courthouse on May 24, 1876, acquitted by a jury of her peers in a verdict that was never appealed or challenged. She collected her few possessions from the sealed cabin, including her ledger, which the court returned to her, and left Stony Lick Hollow on foot, walking the same mountain paths her father had used to keep her isolated. No record exists of where she went or what became of her. Though local legend holds she made her way to a western state and lived under an assumed name until old age. The Thorned Cabin stood empty for 2 years before being dismantled, its stones scattered, and its location deliberately obscured by a community that wanted no monument to the evil that had festered there. But the court records survived, meticulously preserved, ensuring that Elspeth's story and her father's crimes remained documented proof that even in the darkest hollows, truth could surface and justice, however unconventional, could finally be served.